interest rates and the interest rate environment, the market intelligence segment here. I want to talk through Treasury Secretary Bessent's 333 plan that he rolled out as part of the administration here. And I just read Ray Dalio's most recent book, and it really was talking a lot about debt cycles and why nations go broke. And so I want to dive into this a little bit. And what I've seen is that there's a theme of 3% of GDP being a sustainable deficit, meaning that we can run, meaning our revenue can be less than our expenses, and as a percentage of our GDP, that can be about 3%. Now, today, we're at 6.5%, so we're more than double that. But Scott Bessent's 333 plan, the first 3% was we need to get our deficit down to 3% of GDP. So how do you do this? Well, there's 3 different ways, and we're going to talk through that. Second thing is we need to boost GDP growth by 3%, and then increase U.S. energy production to 3 million barrels per day. And so increasing the amount of energy output in oil would decrease energy costs. That helps with the boom with the demand we're seeing for energy with AI, and also just help overall inflation stay tame. GDP growth, it's like if you're got a bunch of credit card debt as an example, well, you can pay the credit card bills off, which is one way, or you can just make a bunch more money, and that makes it a lot easier. So if the GDP grows faster, that makes it a little bit more palatable to pay stuff off. And then as we talk through cutting the deficit to 3% of GDP, that's the hard part, is that actually making cuts. Our government doesn't seem keen on making any cuts. So you can also grow your way out of the deficit if you can kind of keep your expenditures the same, but grow your revenue or your GDP here.
Yeah, I heard an economist speak in the 1990s, and he said that based on where we were in the 1970s, with the oil embargo, with inflation at 18%, and the stuff that went on in the 70s, he said if you would have told him at that point that we'd be sitting where we are in the 1990s, he would have said impossible. And how did we get there? We grew. Yeah. We grew to there.
Yep.
But what happened was we had for the first time a surplus in the government. And what did we do? We spent.
Of course.
Right. And the challenge with the government is when you have a surplus, you can't spend the surplus. Right. And you have to somehow quit, and reduce the spending. So I think this is really interesting. And I think this is a better plan than what I see that the government even talking about. The question is, can we actually get this executed?
Yes, that's a good question. And even the tariff revenue, right, which it's on pace to do over $500 billion already this year. And who knows, we'll see how all this stuff shakes out in the courts. But to your point, it's, ideally that tariff revenue then goes retire some debt. I would not be shocked if all of a sudden Congress says, we got more money to spend, boys.
I know.
We'll see what happens.
All right. That's the one thing, I'm actually reading the John Adams biography right now. And it's interesting that the one thing that I think we left out of the idea that became the United States of America was having a independent part of the government that audits the financial part of the government, that holds the government financially accountable. And they didn't put that in there. And that's why, because if you had someone that could audit the government and hold them financially accountable, we would not be where we are today. It's been way out of control.
Well, I think there is something that does audit the government, because I know I've read about how the Pentagon has failed every audit for the last 10 years. So there is some sort of faction within the government that's supposed to be auditing stuff.
But there's no power.
Yeah, it's true. They just
to say, for example, like in our business, if someone in our business comes to us and says, I want to spend this much money on this one thing, we're going to go, show me how that makes any sense. And then we're going to go, no, you can't get this done for 50% of that. Right. Or where's the money going, and make sure that people aren't wasting it. There's no part of the government that can hold them accountable that way. The way that we get audited by the IRS, right? We get audited by the IRS. The IRS can say, no, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Right. But there's no component of the government that has any actual authority to limit the spending. Or even if they would have, in the beginning in the Constitution, said there's only so much that you can spend as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah, well, I don't think in 1776 they had the foresight.
They didn't have the foresight.
Try to balance the budget.
They did pretty good.
But also the other issue with what you're saying, though, is then is it a non-elected party or non-elected individuals can now tell Congress what they can and cannot do, who are elected officials? Well, then who ends up controlling it are these bean counters?
Yeah, well, I think we could easily get on a tangent on this. And if I had to say who, I would just say it should be me for a while. And then once we get things in a better place, then I'd turn it back over to the U.S. government.
Okay. Would you do it for free?
I would do it for free. I care that much about this country.
You are a civil servant. Thank you, sir. Well, let's talk through Ray Dalio's big debt crisis framework here. So he, similarly to Scott Bessent, says 3% of GDP is kind of the holy grail of where we need to get. So again, deficits divided by GDP, get down to 3%. We're at 6%, so we're not doing very good. We're 6.5%.
It's bad.
And so let's talk through the 3 different ways that you do this. The first way is you can obviously increase tax revenue. If you increase tax revenue, we talked about tariffs, increase tax rates, close tax loopholes, whatever it is. That's one way you can increase revenue. And if you have more revenue, that is going to decrease your deficit. Second option is you can cut spending. It's kind of common sense. Instead of spending so much money, we can just cut spending, which that's, obviously I think we all know that Congress is allergic to that. The third thing is interest rates. And so this all ties back to interest rates. We talked about interest rates last week.
Yep.
But interest rates is a huge factor in driving this. And I have a chart in here that shows our average interest rate from 1995 to 2024 on these 10-year notes was 3.7%. This year, we're at 4.2 is the average. And you can see over time, it's projected to actually come down a little bit. So the CBO is projecting interest rates to come down a little bit, which is good news. But this also, I think, is part of why we're seeing Trump really call for massive decreases in the interest rates, because that helps this budget issue, because we're outlaying over $1 trillion a year on our interest expenses. It's in line kind of with our defense spending, our entitlements to Medicare, Medicaid. So it's becoming a huge piece of the budget is going out the door to interest. And obviously Congress doesn't like it. If they can't control where that $1 trillion goes, they'd love to go spend on other stuff. But the interest rates is a big thing. So how would you fix this problem, right? Increase revenue, decrease expenses, interest rates. How you're doing this for free, obviously.
Yeah.
How are you going to do this?
Well, one thing that I think it's kind of mentioned there in cut expenses, but also I would say more efficient where we're spending our money.
Doge.
I believe that there's, Doge, I love the idea. And I told my friends who were so on fire about that, I said, this is one of the biggest bureaucracies in the world. And there's so many people that benefit from the way things are. It's going to be really hard to shake it up. But I just believe there's a lot of government waste.
Yeah.
And a lot of our taxpayer money is getting wasted. And no one that I know of is really sharpening their pencil and trying to make sure that people aren't overspending. And, I have friends that work for big companies that get their primary revenue from the government, and they say that every year they just mark stuff up 20 or 30% and the government just pays it. Like no one's in there negotiating and fighting for us, for the taxpayers. And I also know people who've worked for the government that they say that they have to spend their budgets because they're afraid if they don't, then they'll get a part cut for the next year. So there's a lot of stuff that's not set up very well. And I also think there's a big problem in Congress, and that's because typically what happens is if you get elected from one state, I get elected from another state, we kind of go behind closed doors and go, hey, make sure you get my spending through, I'll get your spending through.
Yep.
Because really, we don't benefit from cutting spending. We don't get reelected by cutting spending. People are more worried about, do I still get what I get? Do I get what I want from the government? And if you're not going to get me what I want, then I'm going to vote you out of office. So there's no incentive really in Congress for them to say, hey, let's all get together and cut expenses and make this more efficient. So that's where I would go. Because the problem is when you cut taxes, you also, when you increase taxes, you also hurt the economy. And you take the money out of the hands of, our entrepreneurs who are what drive the economy. And you and I, had we, through our business, had less taxes, we would have hired more people and grown faster. Mm-hmm. And that would have helped the economy.
Yeah.
So that's where the rub on increasing taxes. But you know how I feel about taxes.
Well, I wonder where this is going to actually start changing. And I think that for me, maybe it comes to a point where, like you said, people keep getting reelected because they're just trying to bring the pork back to their constituents, which that's the incentive structure for them.
Yep.
But as the deficit keeps staying higher, when the market, which we're already seeing some different global Federal Reserve or global, I should say, asset managers are kind of selling off on the dollar, going more towards gold. If interest rates stay higher for longer, mortgages are more expensive. Credit card debt, like all of this, auto loans, all of this is more expensive. If that stays higher for longer and there's a direct correlation to our federal deficit and debt, and it's because of these elected officials are not cutting, then eventually maybe that's what actually inspires people to hold these elected officials accountable. So I don't know if there's that clear of a correlation yet, but I think that's where I could see something maybe finally changing, because right now it's like, you have Rand Paul, we have very few people who are running or being able to get actually elected saying, hey, we need to balance this budget out. We got to get this figured out, because everyone's just like, well, what's in it for me?
Yeah, I think that's a great thought, but I think the problem is the average voter isn't smart enough to put those things together the way you just explained.
Yeah.
And they've got whoever is running against the other person who's going to try to muddy the water. So I think that clear understanding is going to be hard to get, especially when you've ever seen, when the person goes out on the street and asks people like, who's the vice president or who's on the Supreme Court, and they can't answer when they show pictures, but then they show like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse, and they know all this stuff that doesn't matter, but they don't know the stuff about the government. So I wish people would understand that, but I don't think that's coming anytime soon. So
yeah,
I am concerned. And one thing that we also have to see as a scenario is there's the scenario and where there's this big collapse and this huge problem. And then there's the other scenario where it's just an economic headwind for decade after decade after decade.
Yep.
Because for sure, this much debt is going to slow down our economic growth the same way it's going to slow down growth in Europe and China and Japan and other areas, because most countries in the world do have debt, too much debt.